Hi, everyone. I'm Sam Osterhout, the executive producer here at Lincoln Square, and I'm joined by Andra Watkins, and this is Unholy Ground. Andra, how are you?
I'm great today. I hope everybody's doing well. It's good to see you.
Yeah, good to see you. The work that you've been doing this week is, look, I feel like we're building a temple here. No pun intended. Actually, that was a pun intended.
Christian nationalists wouldn't say that, but we're building a voodoo doll or something really terrible. Yes. And I love voodoo dolls, by the way. So building a voodoo doll.
I know. Make one of me and just give my shoulders a little rub if you don't mind. That would be great. Okay. So every week there are themes that we cover a lot, but we come at them from different angles. And this week we're going to talk a lot about our pal Doug Wilson, who is the pastor. He's Pete Hegseth's pastor, and he is a white Christian nationalist through and through. And last week, was it last week or this week? He did an interview with him. It was last week, right? He did an interview on NPR. And said that his ideal America, in that America, the Constitution itself would be a Christian. It would be a Christian document. And that anyone who couldn't vow to uphold this Christian Constitution, whether they were a Muslim or a Jew or an atheist, they simply couldn't hold public office. And I was struck by, first of all, he says this shit all the time, but he doesn't say it on mainstream media, right? He says it in the Pentagon, but this was to a mainstream outlet. He also said in that same breath that, what he said, the thing that we talked about a lot last week. If you haven't watched last week's episode, go back and have a look. Watch this one first and then go back. But he said this can't be forced, that it takes generations, right? We're a long way off from his personal vision of America. And this is a kind of softening, right, of this message. So I want to talk about all this, because this project didn't start with Doug Wilson. As you point out in your work this week, it's a 165-year-old project. So we're rewriting the Constitution now to be a Christian Constitution. But the real question is, who gets to decide on what that says? So with that, let's talk about the softening first. Let me just play a little clip, and then I want your response.
Okay. Now, you've called for repealing women's right to vote, which is protected by the 19th Amendment.
Right.
Why?
Because it's a good idea. No,
a lot of women wouldn't think so.
A lot of women wouldn't agree. Right. But this is one of my favorite questions now, too. Mm-hmm. This is not an XXXY chromosome issue. Mm-hmm. Because I don't want women voting as individuals.
Yeah. So he goes on to say that we're a long way from this sort of thing. So can you kind of just remind us the strategy that he's employing here?
Yeah. So earlier in the interview, before she specifically asked him about women voting, she said, "I'm a Muslim woman. And so would Muslims effectively not be able to worship publicly and have calls to prayer and that sort of thing?" And he says, "Well, of course you can do whatever you want in your home, but we need to understand that this is a Christian nation, and in the public sphere, the United States would be a Christian nation." So he effectively said, yes, we wouldn't have public calls to prayer and things like that for Muslims because that's in the public square and we would not allow that. But then, so he says the crazy thing, basically.
Yep.
Muslims, of course, won't be able to practice publicly. Then he neuters it by saying, but of course, we're generations away from that. we're not going to do that right away. This is a very diverse country right now, and we won't be able to just come in and force that on people. We're going to have to win people over and evangelize. And so it's going to take a lot of time to accomplish that. But then he repeated, but absolutely, we would have a Christian nation with a Christian constitution. And so he said the crazy thing again. And the whole point of that way of speaking, whether it's Joel Webben, who we highlighted last week, or Doug Wilson, is to say the crazy thing and then tell the hearer this crazy thing isn't really something you need to worry about because it'll take us ages and ages to do it. Maybe it'll never happen, so you don't need to worry about that. And then say the crazy thing again to force the listener. It's an indoctrination tactic to frame the crazy thing with, oh, they'll never do that. Oh, that'll never happen. They also do this another way by having someone like Mark Wayne Mullins say the crazy thing. We're going to close all blue state sanctuary city airports and pull CBP from international flights. And then Mike Johnson comes along and a reporter asks him about that. And he goes, well, I haven't heard anything about that. That's just not something, I'm a busy man. That's not something I have time to think about, which is another way of saying, oh, we'll never do that. You don't need to worry about that.
Yeah.
So they do this multiple ways. And I want more Americans to be aware of how much indoctrination we are all subject to by listening to how these people talk.
Yes. And thank you for being the translator. Like I'm not fluent. I'm definitely not a native speaker, but I see these sentences and I'm like, oh, now I see what's happening here. And so, in that same interview, he says, he talks about how he wants a Christian nation where non-Christians can't hold office. And it's like, we're going to have to rewrite the Constitution to make that happen, except he calls the current Constitution a work of theological genius. He says he loves it. He loves the Constitution, and all of the change can only come through, years of persuasion and evangelism and mass conversion. He insists that all of this is not violent. This is not a violent project. And he notes that, he's been preaching this for 40 years. And finally, he's so glad that it's getting a hearing, right? So
this is the same man who believes in Christian soldiers and spiritual warfare and
yes.
taking spiritual warfare into the public square as actual warfare. So that it's not a violent thing is bullshit. And him saying that is another form of softening the crazy thing.
That's right. And yeah. And I want to play just a little bit more of this interview because it's such a central piece. This is like, if I was teaching a class, you show the example and then you discuss the, right. And this is where we are. So this is, it's really an incredible glimpse into everything we've been talking about over the past year. So let's talk.
Made it clear that you want a Christian theocracy.
Yes.
In this country. You've declared yourself a Christian nationalist. What would that look like in the United States?
It would look like fluffy clouds and unicorns, and everybody would be happy. That's my vision.
That's your vision.
What it would look like in practical terms. Mm-hmm. I would want basically the same constitutional framework that we have now. I love the U.S. Constitution. I think it's a work of theological genius.
So what's happening here?
This is a long-standing argument from the Covenanter movement, which I would say Doug Wilson is a part of. So for those people like me, many Americans like me probably didn't even know what the Covenanter movement was. So it is a movement that started in 1861 by a group of essentially white Christian nationalists in Pennsylvania. It originally was a resolution that was passed by a Presbyterian church. in Pennsylvania that declared that our Constitution was flawed because it did not state overtly that we are a Christian nation and did not make the one true Christian nationalist God the center of our laws and rule of law. And it was pushing for an amendment to the Constitution that would declare those things, that Jesus Christ is the head of, the church, the country, that our laws come from white Christian nationalist interpretations. And they were not as concerned about slavery. Now, this was 1861, and they believed that the Civil War was a result of this flaw in the Constitution that excluded Christ and Christianity from the Constitution. So they were proposing amendments to fix that flaw. And they believed that the Civil War was a result of God judging a nation for not including him in the Constitution. How familiar does this stuff sound? I mean, they never changed their tune. And I can't believe that we can go back 165 years and still find them saying this stuff, this same stuff. And we've never stood up to it and done anything about it. So they believe that slavery would resolve itself if we corrected the Constitution and amended it to make it a Christian Constitution. This group still exists. They are still pushing for these changes to the Constitution, even though they've morphed and changed somewhat over the course of 165 years. But that is essentially what Doug Wilson is wanting here, even though he puts a little charming, Santa Claus type of charm on it, aw shucks. I love the Constitution. It's a great theological document. So that's a pivot from the original Covenanters who called it a secular abomination.
Right.
So,
the pivot, just a little pivot.
Yeah.
So when I wonder about this, and just kind of pause on this for a second, but the Santa Claus bullshit is, his like, oh shucks, I just want what's best for everybody, right? Does he really believe that this world would be so happy and wonderful if everyone had to follow and conform to his own very specific and relatively niche construct of the world? Does he believe that this is a path to happiness, or does he believe what's going on in his brain?
Doug Wilson is a narcissist.
Yes, clearly.
So Doug Wilson defines happiness according to whether or not he's happy. And as long as he's happy, he doesn't care how the rest of us feel about it. He, of course, doesn't see himself as a narcissist and would be able to, with all shucks charm and whatever he pulls out, he's very good at that stuff. And a lot of these people are.
Yeah.
And so it requires us as Americans to constantly question what we value and why we choose to listen to certain people over other people. I'm not the most erudite person. I rewatch our videos and excoriate myself for saying, 10,000 times in them. I have all kinds of verbal tics. There are people who can come on here and be a lot more a better screen presence than me. And our value of that kind of thing ends up elevating people like Doug Wilson.
Right.
So we have to constantly, as Americans, ask ourselves why we're listening to somebody talk.
Yes.
And why we're giving them the ability to persuade us with their presentation. Because Doug Wilson has learned over 40 years how to do that very effectively, and how to rejigger himself for whatever audience he's speaking to. He would do that interview a different way if it weren't NPR.
So it's funny because, when I watch that, when I watch his interview, if I didn't know better, and you in the audience are going to come at me for this, but it is soft, right? It's a soft delivery. It makes me feel almost like, oh, well, you know, he seems like a nice guy. And I'm not saying that's true. I'm just saying, like, describing what Andra is saying, what you're saying, Andra, that this is the delivery that pushes us closer and closer to that dramatic vision. And let me continue this this interview just briefly. We'll watch it in clips to show you exactly what the vision is, because he doesn't not say what he wants. So watch this.
The things that would change would be things that would be at the statutory. Some would be Supreme Court, constitutional amendments, or they might be dealt with other ways. I'd want to see abortion outlawed everywhere. I'd want to see Obergefell overturned. I'd want to see no-fault divorce rejected, overturned. Things like that.
So no same-sex marriage, no abortion.
No same-sex marriage. No. I'd like the LGBTQ plus thing to go away at the legal level. You know, in terms of
there would
law.
be no legal protections for LGBTQ plus folks.
Correct. There would be no special carve-outs for them, right?
And here's where he says the thing, and he's about to soften it. So check this out.
I believe that LGBTQ plus people have the right to think what they think and say what they want to say, and I don't want to prohibit their right to express their views. So that's not. I don't believe in a priori censorship. I don't believe in restricting. Persecuting people who think differently. I think religious minorities, for example, in a Christian republic, should have civil protections.
But you would want to make it illegal for them to be in partnerships. You would want to restrict what they could do in their bedrooms.
And now here's the
you mean like
LGBTQ
sexual partnerships, like marriage? Yeah, so I don't want legal recognition of those relationships, right?
That's it. And that is the strategy. That's the whole strategy. Here's the scary thing I'm going to tell you about. But it's not that scary. I don't believe in persecution.
Mm-hmm.
So the reason we're talking about this now, because, you know, well, let me ask you this. Why was there no podcast like alerting people of this movement 165 years ago, other than the fact that there were no podcasts 165 years ago? What was there a movement bumping up against this? Was there an effort to push back on these people? Because I don't know of one.
Well, obviously, they've never accomplished their goals. So throughout our history, there have been groups who have pushed back. I would see the suffragist movement, for example, as something that would be pushing back against that. I would see Theodore Roosevelt's changes that he made to push back against monopolies and in the original Golden Age, and a lot of the government corruption, as pushing back on some of that. They would fall prey to, just like we are today, whatever brighter, shinier object or set of objects was capturing the public's imagination at that time. And throughout history, we have been told, and this is a construct on the left as well, that we can't criticize Christians, that we can't call them fanatics, that we can't point out how radicalized some of them are, that you know, we can't treat Christians that way, that they have a right to whatever they want to think. And they do. I agree with that. But I have a right to call them radicalized crazy people and try to get more people to understand how radicalized they are. If I had been sitting in that interview with Doug Wilson, and I wish more reporters would ask me how to prep for these interviews.
Yeah.
I would have asked him when he said, I don't want to persecute them, I would have said, define persecution. What does that mean to you? Because forcing people to follow his interpretation of the Bible is correct and right and just to him. That is not persecution to him. But forcing a person who loves the same sex or understands that the body they were born in is not the body that represents who they are as a person, forcing them to not live that truth, to them is persecution. So I would want him to define, well, I don't want to persecute people. Well, what do you mean by that exactly? Define persecution. If you're going to say that these people can't exist legally, how are they not justified in seeing that as persecution and oppression? Explain that to me. That's the kind of stuff I would do to him. If I were questioning him. He'd never talk to me because of that. No. But, you know, I wish more reporters and journalists would ask people like me how to prep for those interviews and how to catch those things when he says them, because he gets away with this softening because they let him, because they don't know how to say what you're doing right now is an indoctrination tactic that is training everyone who's listening to you to think, oh, well, they'll never do that. And I'm not going to let you get away with that.
I mean, it. First of all, if you're just joining us, this is Unholy Ground. Today, the Christian Constitution is what we're talking about. It's a 165-year-old plan. And there's a fight now breaking out over who gets to write this Constitution, right? We know Doug Wilson, Doug Jones. I wish Doug Jones was doing, but sorry, Doug Jones. We know what he wants, and we know also that he's willing to say just the craziest shit, and it makes us, and then soften it, and then push us along the road. Right? It makes us feel like, okay, this is a thing I don't have to worry about right now. But there's another kind of thing breaking out, which you have been touching on in your newsletter. There is this battle. It's a bit of a holy war, right? Over who actually gets to control. And look, I think that this show really is about defining the drive to for white Christian nationalists to be able to take the control and explain to everyone how they ought to live, right? Mm-hmm. That is the underlying premise of this entire thing. We're saying, look, these people want to control your life, right? That's it. However, these people are not unified like these people. Mm-hmm. They are at war with each other. So can you talk a little bit about that? Let's give us an intro on who's in this battle.
Well, in today's newsletter, and today we're recording on Thursday, so for Sunday. So in today's newsletter, I talk about what the Covenanters really want. And Doug Wilson is part of that group, but the original Presbyterian group that formed that associated 11 or more other evangelical sects on the Protestant side into that group. So a lot of the Protestant side of white Christian nationalism now makes up that group. We also have the Catholic side of that group, which the Opus Dei Catholic cult primarily funds and controls the Heritage Foundation and a lot of its satellite organizations, which wrote Project 2025, which was a different approach to the same goal. Rather than saying we want to amend the Constitution, like the Covenanters have done for over 150 years, the Heritage Foundation and its associated groups decided they were going to change what words meant and say the Constitution was always meant to be a Christian document. because the founders were always Christians. And they always meant for this to be a Christian nation and a white Christian nation. They go into great detail on their website in tearing down how when James Madison wrote about everyone having a right to their own minds, which is the seminal function of our founding and democracy. The government does not have the right to control your mind. And that is what Madison believed. There is no dispute about that, except at the Heritage Foundation, except in that camp. They claim on their website that Madison really meant that that only applied to religious matters. And so, therefore, they have a right to repurpose this right to your own mind as religious liberty, which means I have the right to force my white Christian nationalism in every quarter of America, and you can't say anything about it. And we can have a Christian nation that way. That, I am convinced, was the impetus for Paul Weyrich and ultimately Jerry Falwell and all of them to start this movement. They decided, we'll just take the existing Constitution and redefine what the words mean by using a concept called originalism, where we can't go back and resurrect the founders and ask them what they literally meant, much like we can't ask God what the Bible means. So they were informed by the Bible and how all these sects argue about what different verses mean. With originalism, it's applying that biblical garbage to the Constitution, essentially. And so they can say, this is what we think it originally means, and nobody can prove they're right. And so they have decided to make the Constitution in their image and use the existing words. And I'm convinced they want to abolish all the amendments, including the Second Amendment, because a fascist government cannot operate with an armed populace.
Right.
They cannot allow that. So at some point that will even fall, because it has to if they consolidate enough power. So I believe they want to get back to the original document and reframe the original document using their originalist worldviews and their planted Supreme Court justices. That crowd has captured the executive branch, the judicial branch in the form of the Supreme Court, and for the time being, the legislative branch. Even though, as I say in my newsletter today, Doug Wilson controls the military.
Right.
And he controls the military through Pete Hegseth. And if Pete Hegseth were forced to choose between his spiritual daddy, Doug Wilson, and his orange daddy, he's going to choose his spiritual daddy. If his spiritual daddy gives him an order to start a holy war or a crusade, I believe Pete Hegseth would follow that order. And I believe the legislative branch in the form of Mike Johnson is playing between which faction is going to win. I believe he's truly on the side of the Doug Wilson and Protestant faction.
Seems like it.
But he also is going along with essentially turning Congress into the Duma on behalf of the Heritage Foundation folks so that they can transform the executive branch via their originalist view that the founders meant for unitary executive theory to be a thing.
It does.
That's the lay of the land that I outlined today and where I think all these factions are. They don't agree about whose version of Christianity should rule. When Doug Wilson says, I believe the Apostles' Creed should be inserted into the Constitution, that was originally a Catholic thing. It says Holy Catholic Church in it. So Doug Wilson's version has to asterisk Catholic and say, this means the true Christian church, not Catholic Church. So they don't even agree about those fundamental things. So while they are still working toward this concept of a white Christian nationalist nation, we don't know how they're going to have to fight it out in terms of who would actually define what that means.
I think Mike Johnson is a perfect example of this tension, because he understands, he has his core beliefs, which I agree seem to fall more on the Doug Wilson side, but he also understands the mechanisms of power and who is wielding an incredible amount of power. And that the Project 2025 folks at Heritage and Opus Dei and all of that are entrenched. They really are entrenched.
And a lot of the billionaire money is from that faction also.
Yes. And it seems as if there is a sort of like, like a running to-do list, like just take over the government, like take over the government, take away the rights, unify the executive, eliminate the power of the legislative, pack the court, and then eventually like figure out, whose God is the right one. Right. Or, like that's sort of down, like, let's get to these places. Then we can have our real holy war. Mm-hmm. But it doesn't take into account us and everyone watching this show and the millions, tens of hundreds of millions of people who don't believe any of this shit. Right? Right. We have agency and we have power. And it is why we have this show, so that we can have a space where we're like, no. You like, I love it that they aired his interview on NPR, but we have to do something with that information. We have to Andra Watkins that guy. Like my favorite quote of this is, that's what I would do to him. We got to do something to these people, and by do something, it means hold up what they're saying, their nonsense, to the light, and then say, no, we can't do it.
And that means, unfortunately for all of us, breaking this longstanding rule that we have that has also been indoctrinated into us for generations, that we're not supposed to talk about politics and religion because that's rude and that makes people uncomfortable, and we're just not supposed to have those arguments. It's unbecoming. It makes people feel icky. So let's just not.
Yeah.
And really, we should be talking about these things all the time.
All of it. All of the time. And look, there's a deep hypocrisy in all of this that I think needs to be repeated. And that is, you can't attack somebody's personally held beliefs, right? But these beliefs are not preternatural. They came to these beliefs through enculturation, right? They were born into a white Christian nationalist thing, and they every day choose to believe this bullshit with certainty. And I know you wouldn't say that exactly, Andra. You would say they have a right to their beliefs and all this kind of thing. And I agree. But we're not allowed to puncture or question or talk about any of those beliefs that they choose to believe. However, they are allowed to come at LGBTQ plus people. They are allowed to come at people who, oh my God, I love it so much that happens that I will never change it. I'm not even trying to fix that. I love it.
It happens almost every week, and it's glorious.
Because I'm always like counting on my thumb for some reason. But we're not. And the things that, LGBTQ plus people don't choose that. It's not a choice. Right.
Well, according to them, it is, but that's neither here nor there.
It's garbage. Right. If it was a choice for them, then gender and sexuality is a choice for the white Christian nationalists as well. And I think somebody ought to say, Doug Wilson, when did you choose to be straight? Like, when did that happen for you? Right? When did you choose to be heterosexual? And he would say, well, it wasn't a choice for me. And I'm like, oh, but it's a choice for everyone else.
He was born that way, and he has honored his God assigned sexuality.
It is deep hypocrisy, and I'm so
Right.
sick of it. I'm so sick of
Right.
it.
But that means that pushing back against this means more than merely talking about the culture war aspects of it.
Yes.
It makes me very upset to see how many clips of they want to rob women of the right to vote have gone viral from this interview. And that seems to be all we're going to talk about from this interview, which is why we're doing this show today. Having the Apostles' Creed in the Constitution and only allowing Christians to hold public office, which is the other piece of this, is his second point that he's demanding, ahead of all these culture war things. And when he says practicing Christians, he means practicing white Christian nationalist men. And practicing is carrying a lot of weight in that statement, because he'll have a list of things that you'll have to do that are purity tests to constantly prove that you're a real practicing white Christian nationalist man.
Yeah.
Those things are more important to understand, in my view, and push back against. And more Americans need to get comfortable doing that.
I agree. And I think, you know, there's a thing, you know, that this reminds me of, which is this concept of locker room talk, right? That men are just going to say, you know, sexist, racist stuff because it's just locker room talk.
They don't really mean it.
I don't mean it. It's just, you know, we're not trying to hurt anybody. There's a movement among men to say, hey, don't say that. Like, you shouldn't say that shit. Knock that off. It's this very similar thing. You have to, when somebody says something that is dangerous and that is the Doug Wilson style messaging, you have to say, don't say that. Like, that's crazy. Like, you have to stop. You have to.
I wouldn't do it. I would say, you know, Doug Wilson, you have every right to be an asshole and to preen around showing how much of an asshole you are. But you don't have a right to force me to believe any of this or do any of this, because I have a right to my own mind too.
That's right.
You know, that's where we really need to get to help. These people have twisted the Bible to be able to say that they have a right to control our minds. That's really what they're saying. If you're telling an LGBTQ person that they cannot be who they are, then they're essentially saying you don't have a right to your own mind. And that is persecution. And we should push back a lot harder on that part, on the Christian nationalist, I have a right to control you aspects of this than we do.
I agree. Well, everyone, we're wrapping up. Andra and I just made a decision in the green room, by the way. We're going to do a special live show next Thursday, whatever the date of that is. That's the 23rd at 10. Should we say 10:30?
10:30 Eastern is good.
We'll do 10:30 Eastern because we want to engage with you all in the audience. And so pass that along. We'll start promoting that this week, Sunday, Monday. You'll get the link. You'll be able to join us live and ask all of your questions and engage in that. So be looking out for that. I'm really excited to be. I love the chat.
I like it being recorded because I come into the chat every Sunday and just spend my whole time answering questions. So
I know I
hope this will be a really useful time for y'all so that you can ask me questions directly and we can answer them in real time.
Yeah. Well, Andra, thank you. This was very enlightening. And Doug Wilson can get bent, man. That guy needs to go away.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Thanks, everyone. We'll see you next time for Unholy Ground.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.